Are you ready for chapters 26 and 27? We'll begin now with chapter 26. Jax came back to himself in a place that definitely wasn't his IS 222. A sharp antiseptic smell penetrated the never-ending gale of blowback. White walls, stainless steel, a hospital. He sat up in bed, tugging on the IV in his arm. That explained why, in spite of everything, he felt pretty good. For days, nausea from the hypnotic onslaught had prevented him from keeping anything down, but he could be given fluids and nutrition directly through the tube. Maybe Butch Brockman did me a favor. There's a first for everything. Then he felt the back of his head and wished he hadn't. An egg-sized lump under a soft gauze bandage and pain to spare. At least it's real, he reflected. Getting hurt was a reminder that in spite of everything, the laws of science still applied to Jackson Opus. At this point, the bump on his head was practically the only thing anchoring him to the real world. He peered outside the blue curtain that surrounded his bed. Nurses and orderlies bustled around, gurneys rattled, and muted PA announcements could be heard. Jax was still in his school clothes, so he guessed it was emergency room. It was probably the best place for him on the day of the election. Not that he could explain the nature of his emergency to the doctor. He picked up the remote from the bedside table and switched on the TV that was mounted on the wall bracket. As he flipped channels, a headline in the CNN news crawl stopped his thumb. Exit polls point to Douglas landslide in New York Democratic primary. Victory would be clinch nomination. Jax leaned back on his head bump, which was agonizing even in contact with a soft pillow. No amount of blowback could distract his mind from the meaning of this news. Mako's plan was working, and he, Jackson Opus, was the key instrument that made it so. With one lousy video, you've destroyed a system that's lasted more than 200 years. But what choice did he have with his parents? What choice did he have with his parents' lives hanging in the balance? Of course, history was filled with stories of heroes who had made devastating sacrifices for the good of many. I'm no hero. He couldn't even comfort himself with the thought of that. He couldn't even comfort himself with the thought of that. If he didn't cooperate, Mako would find somebody else. There was nobody else. He been in a unique position to stop his freight train in its tracks. Instead, he poured on more coal. At the time, he followed the only path that made sense in order to protect his family. In the process, he'd subverted nothing less than the American system of democracy, and now it was over. Were Mom and Dad any safer? No, Mako hadn't removed the suggestion he'd implanted in them. They were in just as much danger as before, maybe more, because now the director knew Jax could be blackmailed into anything in order to save the people he loved. It almost tore Jax in two. He had more hypnotic ability than Mako. The director himself had said so. So, he should be able to overpower the man. But the one time he tried, he'd been slapped down like a pesky insect. His inexperience had held him back. And he'd never get any better, because the only person who could train him and develop his gift was Mako himself. He was stuck. Nobody would ever take his side in this fight, because the whole world thought Elias Mako had devoted his life to New York City education and blah, blah, blah. There was not a single living soul who could see the director of Cynthia for what he was. When the answer came to Jax, it was like a sunrise bursting over the horizon, casting glow even through the firestorm of hypnotic images that still battered him. There was one person who saw through Mako. Axel Braintree. Axel knew from the start that Mako was ruthless, dishonest, and dangerous. He tried to recruit Jax to be his spy at the Institute. Jax had been stupid enough to rebuke him. Not anymore. Right now, the president of Sandman's Guild was Jax's only hope. "Oh, you're awake," a white-clad nurse burst in through the curtain. "You took a nasty fall. How are you feeling?" "Pretty good," Jax lied. He swung a leg over the side of the bed. In fact, I'm really anxious to get back to school. She pushed him back down with a hand that was gentle yet firm. School will get along without you. Now. She maneuvered the bed tray in front of him and dropped a thick sheaf of forms onto it. I have some admissions paperwork for you to fill out. But I don't want to be admitted, Jax protested. I want to be released. Well, you can't be discharged until you've been admitted. She reasoned, slapping a pen on top of the stack. I'll check on you in a little while. As soon as he was gone, Jack shoved the tray away, yanked the IV needle out of his arm, and kicked into his sneakers. The ER was busy. No one was going to notice a 12-year-old with a banged head. His sole worry was his own nurse. Losing a patient with unfinished paperwork was probably a hanging offense he didn't know which hospital he was at. He was almost home free, the door to the outside 10 paces in front of him, when a half-demented voice shouted, "Somebody grab that kid!" 2 large orderlies started down toward him, but Jax was already running. He blasted through the waiting room and out the automatic sliders. Blowback still battered and disoriented him, but he was pleased to note that the urgency of the moment was keeping him focused. He found himself sprinting away with Beth Israel Medical Center, losing himself in the Union Square Farmers Market. Over his shoulder, he saw the orderlies burst out of the building, look around, and turn back to the hospital. Apparently, he wasn't worth chasing, not even for the crime of unfilled-out forms. His minor triumph energized him. Finally, something had gone right. Next order of business, Axel Braintree, the president of the Sandman's Guild, had given him a card, but Jax had no idea what he'd done with it. His one connection to the man was the Easy Wash laundromat on 7th Avenue, where the guild held its weekly gatherings. It was about a 15-minute walk from Union Square. He entered the grimy storefront, brushing past the customers and their baskets, and barged into the back room where the meeting was held. Empty. Okay, Jax told himself. You know, this was a long shot. He still has to be somewhere. Jax had just resolved to return home and turn the apartment upside down before looking for Braintree's business card when he recognized the very tall woman at dryer number 8. She was a Sandman. Sandwoman? He'd seen her at the meeting. Evelyn Lowless, the one who used to make her living hypnotizing beauty contest judges. He rushed up to her. I need to talk to Axel Braintree. She fed quarters into the machine, never turning to face him. Do I look like his mother? I know you're in the Sandman's Guild. Please, it's an emergency. She regarded him for the first time. You're the Opus kid. What do you need Axel for? She brightened. You looking for a business partner? It's about Elias Mako. 10 seconds later, she had Braintree on her cell phone and handed it to Jax. Buffeted by blowback and embarrassed at how he dismissed the man before, Jax blurted out his message. Mako rigged the election. Braintree didn't ask how or demand any supporting information. His response was immediate and 100% to the point. Where are you? The laundromat. Don't move, Braintree ordered. I'll be there in 10 minutes. All right, so he's gotten in touch with Braintree. and he's on his way to the laundromat because he knows that there's some big problems. So chapter 27. Jax would not have believed how glad he was to see the gray ponytail bouncing in through the laundromat entrance. Braintree himself was shocked at the sight of Jax, visibly thinner, very pale, with haunted, bloodshot eyes. What happened to you, kid? What did Mako do to you? Jax poured out the whole story, his voice cracking. Hearing the tale from day one was almost worse than living it. At least in reality, it all happened gradually. Recounting it was close to experiencing the entire nightmare in a few minutes. Remote hypnotism? Braintree exclaimed in amazement. Of course. It's been tried, but no one's ever succeeded before. This changes everything we thought we knew about what it is to be a Sandman. He frowned. But why do you look like you've been released from a torture chamber? I haven't been released, Jax quavered. I'm still in it. You know how it kind of snaps your strength when you've got a mesmeric link with someone? Well, I've got a mesmeric link with everyone who sees the video clip. Hundreds of thousands of people, maybe more. Of course, Braintree was horrified. The link would exist regardless of whether or not the hypnotism was being performed in person. It must be overwhelming. Jax nodded miserably. It feels like regular link at first, but then you get so many at a time that it's just a blur. Eventually, it gets so bad that you can't eat, you can't sleep, you can barely walk. At this point, I can't tell if I feel so awful from the blowback or the fact that I haven't had a decent meal or good night's sleep in over a week. Not to mention the knock on the head I got from falling down the stairs. I'm not good. Braintree was alarmed. You look terrible. But what really concerns me is that what you're going through is something no one has ever suffered before. We have no idea what the long-term damage might be. Maybe we should take you to the hospital. Jax laughed mercilessly. I just escaped from one. That's what we have to do to find a way to stop Mako from hijacking the election without bringing him down on my folks. The old man glanced at the laundromat clock, which was in the shape of a pair of sweat socks. The polls close in a few hours. There's not much we can do to influence the voting now. We can work on thwarting him in the presidential election, but before we can do that, we have to make sure your parents will be safe. Neither of Jack's parents were answering their cell phones. Next, Jax tried calling them at work. The receptionist at the Bentley dealership said that Ashton Opus had to leave the office on a family emergency. His son's in the hospital, you know. Dr. Opus's chiropractic office had a recorded message explaining that the clinic was closed due to unforeseen circumstances. Due to unforeseen circumstances. They're at Beth Israel, trying to find me. They are at Beth Israel trying to find me, Jax concluded. I'm really not psyched to go back to that place. The nurse is probably still ticked off. Call your parents again, Braintree instructed. Leave messages. Have them meet us at home. We have to act before Mako gets his hooks into them. As the taxi bore them toward the Opus's apartment, Jax had questions for the president of the Sandman's Guild. How are we going to help them? Is it possible to undo what Dr. Mako did? One step at a time, Braintree smoothed. We won't know what until we get inside their heads. My dad's going to flip, Jax groaned. He's hated hypnotism his whole life, and my mom's in total denial. Wait till I show up with you to perform mental exploration and odd jobs. We'll be quick as we can, the old man promised. I suggest you put your mother under so she's not alarmed while I'm hypnotizing your father. Oh, I don't want to see inside my mother's brain. All those private thoughts and lady stuff, I get skeeved out just looking at her eyelash curler. Courage, Jax. Remember what you're doing it for. The reception at home was overwhelming. Both parents were so relieved to see their son in one piece that any inconvenience and alarm was readily forgotten. Mrs. Opus enveloped Jax in a motherly hug, and Mr. Opus put his arm around his son's shoulder, whispering, "What's up with Farmer Ponytail?" "Mom, Dad, I want you to meet Axel Braintree, a friend of mine." "Not from school, I guess," said his mother lamely. "Delighted to meet you." Braintree handed each parent a business card. Ashton Opus read, "Mental explorations. Wait, you're not one of..." He would have said more, but the old man fixed him with a penetrating stare, and he was instantly in a trance. It was the first time Monica Opus had ever witnessed hypnotism firsthand, and it scared her witless. She snatched up a crystal vase and wielded it like a weapon. "Get away from my husband, you!" Jax leaped in front of her and fixed his dark eyes on hers. "Jackson Howard Opus, don't you dare." That was as far as she got. Her pip reflected back at him clearer than the chaotic jumble of pictures he continued to receive. "Hurry up," he tossed over his shoulder. "When she comes out of it, she's going to kill me." There was no response from the old man, who was deep in mesmeric link with Mr. Opus. Jax may have had the stronger natural gift, but he had never been a hypnotist so completely focused as Braintree. His attention shone like an interrogator's lamp on Dad, who seemed to be answering quietly. The head Sandman had devoted his life to his guild to resisting the temptation to bend people. It was plain, though, that when he did it, he could be extremely good at it. But is he good enough to undo the deadly suggestion Mako planted inside Dad? Is something like that even possible? If this was unsuccessful, the consequences would be dire, and not just for Mom and Dad, but for the first time his thoughts turned to the terrible state of his own health. Drawn and pale, gaunt and anxious, and who knew what was causing it all? He pulled himself up short. Wait a minute. He knew exactly what was causing this current predicament. These were his thoughts. These weren't his thoughts. They were Mom's. He was starting to pick up her emotions through the mesmeric link. The last thing a guy needs to know is what his mother's innermost feelings. He tried to close his mind a little, but felt the link wavering, so he abandoned that idea. Fine, he couldn't keep out his mother's thoughts. At least she could distract him. He could distract himself so she wouldn't have to receive them. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held? This patriotic anthem was interrupted by Braintree tapping him on the shoulder. Dad was waiting patiently, eyes half closed, in hypnotic neutral. Well, Jax hissed. I know what we're up against. The old man took a deep breath. It's nasty, even for Mako. Jax was deflated. I was kind of hoping he was just bluffing. I won't mention the trigger word yet. It's too dangerous. When they hear it, both your parents will proceed to the nearest subway station and throw themselves in front of an uptown train. Jax was overcome with rage and terror in the same instant. What kind of monster comes up with something like that? I told you Dr. Mako was not what he seems, except to me. To me, he's always been unacceptable. Unacceptable is not even the term Jax would have chosen. But you fixed it, right? Now we can just do the same thing to Mom. The president of the Sandman's Guild shook his head firmly. I don't like Elias Mako, but his understanding of the inner machinery of the human mind is unparalleled. This cannot be fixed in the way you mean it. Jax was appalled. Why not? Can't we just put in a suggestion of our own? You know, when you hear the trigger word, don't jump in front of a subway train. There's no hypnotic trick, Braintree explained. Mako has managed to ingrain the suggestion into the basic foundation of your father's sense of himself. Even more dangerous, he seems to have built in a safeguard against any counter-suggestion we might make. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but if we try to override Mako's handiwork, it might have the reverse effect of setting it all off. Jax was in a panic. You mean there's nothing we can do? That means I'm Mako's slave forever, or else my parents die. I wouldn't go that far, the old man assured him. If all the conditions of Mako's hypnotic command can be met, then the suggestion will disappear. You can only die once, after all. Jax was distraught. But they'll be dead. The art of suggestion is very literal. Braintree lectured. That's why Sandman makes lousy little league coaches. When you tell a kid to steal a base and he sticks it under his shirt and he runs for the parking lot. The link with Mrs. Opus was flickering in and out. If Jax didn't concentrate, she'd be awake in a moment, and none too pleased with her son. But how could anybody misinterpret throw yourself in front of a train? Jax challenged. You're going to have to trust me. The last person I trusted was Mako. I'm not Mako. No, Jax agreed. You're a convicted art thief who holds self-help meetings in a laundromat. But do you trust me? Braintree persisted. And Jax was amazed to discover that he did. Okay, so Braintree has an idea, a plan of how they can help Jax's parents. So when we come back with chapter 28, which 28 I believe we'll be reading just by itself, we will see what the plan is maybe. Okay, so we'll see you soon. Bye.